He signed a marriage contract with a stranger, but what she did changed his life forever. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us get back to our main character. The gray Texas sky hung low over the small college town, rain streaking across the sidewalks like threads of silver. Mark Davis walked alone, his backpack heavy on one shoulder, his mind weighed down by unpaid bills and student loans. At 23, he was finishing law school while juggling 2 part-time jobs and caring for his sick mother. Every breath felt like debt. His phone buzzed, startling him. Mark Davis speaking, he answered, trying to sound composed. The voice on the other end was firm, elegant, and unfamiliar. Mr. Davis, this is Eleanor Brooks. I would like to meet you. It concerns your financial situation. Mark frowned, confused. I am sorry, who are you? How do you know about I know enough, she interrupted. Meet me at Brooks Bistro at 7 o'clock sharp. It is important. Before he could respond, the call ended. That night, rain poured harder, soaking through his jacket as he hurried to the address. Brooks Bistro glowed warm behind its glass doors, a place he could never afford. Inside, soft jazz played, and at a corner table sat a woman who looked like she belonged to another world. Eleanor Brooks' silver hair perfectly styled, pearls glinting under the chandelier motioned him to sit. Mark, she said, her tone calm yet commanding. Please, have a seat. He hesitated before lowering himself across from her, the scent of Earl Grey tea and polished leather surrounding them. Mrs. Brooks, he said cautiously, how exactly can you help me? She smiled slightly. I know about your father's debts, your tuition, and your mother's medical bills. You are a smart young man, but life has not been fair. I can offer you a solution. Mark's heart thudded. A solution? She leaned forward. Marry me. The word hung in the air like thunder. He blinked, sure he had misheard. Excuse me? You heard me. This is not about love, Mr. Davis. It is a business arrangement. You will be my husband in name only. In return, I will clear every debt, pay for your mother's care, and ensure your future. Think of it as a contract. Mark stared, caught between disbelief and desperation. Why me? You do not even know me. Precisely, she said. You are unattached, desperate enough to consider it, and unlike most men, you will not ask for more than what is written. I do not need affection, Mark. I need companionship. A signature. A man who will not betray me. His chest tightened. The rain beat harder against the window, a rhythm to his racing thoughts. This is insane, he whispered. Perhaps, she replied softly, but it could save you. That night, back in his small apartment, Mark sat at the kitchen table with his mother. Her thin fingers clutched a cup of tea, her eyes full of worry. When he explained the proposal, she fell silent for a long time. Finally, she said, I know it sounds unthinkable, but maybe she is offering you a way out. You could save us. Mark looked at her trembling hands, the oxygen tube resting at her nose, and felt the weight of his choices press down. You are asking me to marry a woman I do not love, he murmured. I am asking you to live, she replied. The next morning, Mark returned to Brooks Bistro. Eleanor was already there, her posture flawless, her expression unreadable. You have decided? She asked, not looking up from her tablet. Mark took a slow breath. I will do it. She set the tablet down, meeting his eyes for the first time. Good. The arrangements will be made immediately. As he left the cafe, rain still fell, but something inside him shifted. He had no idea that by signing one piece of paper, his life and hers was about to change forever. A week later, Mark stood inside the county courthouse, his palms damp despite the chill of the air conditioning. The ceremony was short, quiet, almost clinical. Only Eleanor's lawyer and a notary stood as witnesses. As the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Mark's chest tightened. He slipped the gold band onto her finger, the ring cool and unfamiliar. Eleanor turned to him with a small, practiced smile. "Welcome to your new life, Mr. Davis." The words echoed in his mind as they walked out into the gray afternoon. Outside, rain drizzled lightly on the courthouse steps. A black sedan waited at the curb, the driver holding the door open. Mark climbed in beside her, unsure whether to speak. The silence was thick, broken only by the hum of tires on wet pavement. After several minutes, she said, "You can move into the guest suite tonight. The staff has been informed." Mark stared out the window at the blur of passing streets. "You have staff?" She glanced at him, amused. "Of course. You will get used to it." The car turned through iron gates that opened slowly, revealing a mansion that looked like something out of a magazine. Massive stone columns, manicured gardens, and windows glowing gold against the rain. As they stepped inside, the air smelled faintly of lavender and wood polish. A housekeeper greeted them with a bow. "Welcome home, Mrs. Brooks." "Mr. Davis." "Home." The word felt strange. Eleanor led him up a grand staircase and stopped before a door at the far end of the hall. "This will be your room," she said. "Dinner is at 7. Formal attire." Her tone left no room for questions. When she turned away, Mark stood there for a moment, taking in the space. The room was larger than his entire apartment. Mahogany furniture, silk drapes, a view of the gardens through tall windows. It was beautiful, but cold, untouched by life. That evening, he dressed in the suit Eleanor's assistant had delivered earlier, the fabric smoother than anything he had ever worn. At the long dining table, she sat at the opposite end, perfectly poised, every move deliberate. The food looked like art, plated with precision. He could not even pronounce half of what was served. They ate mostly in silence until she said, "You will need to attend several public events with me starting next week. They will expect us to behave like a married couple." Mark nodded stiffly. "Understood." In return, she continued, her eyes sharp over the rim of her glass, "I will ensure your mother receives the best medical care available. I have already arranged it." His fork paused midair. "You did?" "I keep my promises, Mr. Davis. That is the foundation of any contract." Her words should have comforted him, but instead they felt like a chain tightening around his chest. After dinner, he wandered through the quiet halls, portraits of Eleanor's ancestors staring down from gilded frames. The house was stunning, but it did not feel alive. At the far end of the corridor, he found a door slightly ajar. Inside was a study filled with books and a grand piano beneath a dust cover. He touched a framed photograph on the shelf, a young Eleanor beside a man with kind eyes. Before he could look closer, her voice cut through the silence. "You should not be in here." Mark turned, startled. She stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "I am sorry," he said quickly. "I was just exploring," she finished, her voice softer now. "That was my husband. He died 15 years ago." The admission hung between them, heavy with something unspoken. "I am sorry," Mark murmured. She nodded once, her eyes distant. "Do not be." Some contracts end sooner than expected. Then she turned and walked away, leaving him alone with the echo of her footsteps. That night, lying in a bed too soft for comfort, Mark stared at the ceiling. Outside, thunder rolled faintly in the distance. He thought of his mother, safe now because of this marriage. But as the rain tapped against the glass, he could not shake the feeling that he had stepped into a story whose ending was already written, and he was not sure he liked the role he had agreed to play. Days turned into a quiet rhythm inside the Brooks estate. Mark woke each morning to the faint sound of birds outside the tall windows, the scent of coffee already drifting up from the kitchen below. The housekeepers moved silently through the halls like shadows, polishing surfaces that already gleamed. Eleanor kept to her study most days, emerging only for meetings or the carefully scheduled dinners that had become their only shared ritual. They spoke little, their words clipped and formal, as if every sentence were another clause in their strange contract. Yet small details began to draw Mark's attention. Eleanor never ate breakfast, only black coffee. She read the newspaper but never the society pages. And sometimes, late at night, when she thought no one was watching, she would play the grand piano in the study. The melody, soft and mournful, carried through the empty halls like a ghost's whisper. One evening, Mark stopped by the doorway, unseen, and listened. Her fingers moved with aching precision, and for the first time, she looked human, not the untouchable woman who had bought his name, but someone fighting her own silence. The next morning, over coffee, he said quietly, "You play beautifully." She looked up, surprised. "I did not know anyone heard." "It is hard not to," he said. A flicker of something, maybe gratitude, maybe caution, crossed her face. "Music keeps me busy. It fills the hours." The conversation ended there, but it lingered with both of them. As weeks passed, Eleanor began to include Mark in small details of her life. She asked his opinion on a charity proposal, invited him to accompany her to a gallery opening. In public, she played the role of the poised benefactor. Mark stood beside her, polite and silent, the perfect companion. Yet behind closed doors, he started to glimpse the cracks beneath her composure. One afternoon, after a luncheon, she stumbled slightly in the hallway. Mark caught her before she fell. For a second, her guard dropped. "Low blood pressure," she murmured, pulling her hand back quickly. "I am fine." But she was not. That night, Mark found her sitting alone in the dark study, staring at an old photograph. The same man from before, her late husband. "You loved him," Mark said softly. She did not look away. "We built everything together." "But love," she paused, her voice faltering for the first time, "love is not always enough to keep someone here." He wanted to say anything, but the words would not come. Instead, he poured her a glass of water and sat nearby, silent. From then on, something unspoken shifted between them. Their dinners grew less formal, their silences warmer. She laughed once, quietly, at one of his clumsy jokes, and the sound startled them both. It was rare, delicate, like sunlight breaking through clouds. But not everything in the mansion was soft. Mark began to notice a pattern of phone calls that left Eleanor tense, her expression unreadable. One evening, after she ended a call abruptly, he asked, "Is everything all right?" "It is business," she said too quickly. "Investors can be demanding." Yet later that night, he overheard fragments of another conversation, hushed, urgent, fearful. Words like inheritance, board control, and deadline. When she caught him listening, her voice turned cold again. "Eavesdropping is not part of our agreement, Mr. Davis." "I am sorry," he said, stepping back. "I was just worried." "Do not be," she replied sharply. "Worry implies attachment, and that was never part of the deal." The distance between them returned like a locked door. But as Mark lay awake in his room, he could not ignore the unease twisting in his chest. The woman he had married for money was no longer just a name on a contract. She was real, vulnerable, and something about the way she hid her pain made him want to understand it, even if it meant breaking every rule they had written. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows, casting gold lines across the marble floor. Mark adjusted the collar of his suit as he followed Eleanor down the grand staircase. Today was the first of the charity events she had mentioned, a formal luncheon with influential donors. The mansion buzzed with activity, staff moving briskly, fresh flowers arriving by the dozen. Eleanor moved among them with effortless authority, her presence commanding yet distant. When the car pulled up to the downtown hotel, reporters already waited outside, flashes bursting like lightning. Eleanor slipped her hand through Mark's arm and whispered, "Smile, Mr. Davis. Appearances are everything." He did as she asked, though the cameras made his skin crawl. Inside the ballroom, chandeliers glittered above tables draped in white linen. The air smelled of perfume and money. Eleanor greeted guests with grace, her laughter polite but hollow. Mark stood beside her, nodding when introduced, pretending to belong. Yet even in the crowd, he noticed small gestures, the way she tightened her grip on his arm when certain men approached, the flicker of discomfort in her eyes when someone mentioned the Brooks Foundation. During the speeches, she leaned toward him slightly. "When this is over, remind me to meet the Carter investors privately," she murmured. "They have been unpredictable." He nodded, but her words echoed uneasily. After the luncheon, as they exited through the side hallway, a journalist called out, "Mrs. Brooks, is it true you married Mr. Davis to secure control of the foundation's assets?" The room froze. Eleanor's expression did not change, but her fingers dug into Mark's arm. "No further questions," she said smoothly, guiding him away. In the car, silence hung heavy. Mark finally asked, "Is that what they think?" Her gaze remained fixed on the window. "People always assume money is the reason for everything." He hesitated. "And is it?" Her head turned, her eyes sharp. "Careful, Mr. Davis." Curiosity was not in the contract. That night, back at the mansion, Mark found himself unable to sleep. He paced the balcony, the city lights glimmering below. The question burned in his mind: what was she protecting, and from whom? The next morning, an envelope lay on his breakfast tray. Inside was a schedule typed in neat lines: upcoming charity dinners, investor meetings, and travel dates. At the bottom, in her handwriting, was a single note. "Remember your role." Mark sighed, pressing the paper flat. He had promised himself to play along, to survive this arrangement. But the longer he stayed, the more he wanted to understand the woman behind the polished surface. One evening, after another long day of meetings, he found her sitting alone in the garden gazebo, staring at the fading sunset. For once, she looked small against the vastness of the estate. "You should not be out here without a coat," he said quietly. She looked up, startled, then smiled faintly. "Old habits. I used to sit here with himmy husband. We planned everything under this roof. The gardens, the business, even the future that never came." Her voice trembled, then steadied. "After he died, I learned how quickly people turn loyalty into greed. The board tried to take everything. That is why I needed this marriage. To prove stability. To remind them I still hold control." Mark stood there, the truth settling heavily. It had never been about loneliness or romance. It was survival. "You could have told me," he said. "And would you have agreed?" she asked softly. He opened his mouth, but no answer came. She rose, brushing past him, her perfume lingering in the air like a memory. "Do not mistake this arrangement for affection, Mark. It will only make things harder." When she was gone, he sat on the bench where she had been. The air was cool, the night quiet except for the distant hum of the fountain. He stared at the ring on his finger, realizing it was both a promise and a prison. Somewhere between duty and desire, the lines were beginning to blur, and for the first time, he did not know which side he wanted to be on. The weeks that followed blurred into a pattern of public appearances and private distance. Eleanor and Mark attended galas, charity banquets, and board meetings together. They smiled for the cameras, exchanged polite glances, and played their roles so convincingly that even Mark began to forget what was real and what was rehearsed. Yet behind the glittering facade, the tension between them grew heavier. Eleanor was more guarded than ever, her phone always within reach, her expression tightening with every unknown call. One night, Mark overheard fragments of another conversation through the study door, her voice low but trembling. "I will not sell. Not now, not ever. You tell them I am still in control." There was a pause, then the sound of glass breaking. He pushed the door open. Eleanor stood near the fireplace, her hand bleeding where she had dropped a crystal tumbler. "Eleanor," he said quickly, crossing the room. She tried to hide her hand, but the blood was already staining her sleeve. "It is nothing," she murmured. He took her wrist gently, wrapping his handkerchief around the cut. That does not look like nothing. For a moment, she let him hold her hand. The firelight flickered over her face, softening her usual steel. You should not have heard that, she said quietly. They want to take everything. The board, my late husband's partners, they see me as weak because I married again. Her voice broke slightly. They think this marriage was desperation. Mark met her eyes. Then prove them wrong. You are the strongest person I have ever met. She gave a short, disbelieving laugh. Strength is just what people call survival when they have no choice. She pulled her hand back and turned away. The next morning, she was gone before dawn, leaving only a note, board meeting in Dallas. Do not wait up. The house felt empty without her presence, and for the first time, Mark realized how much space she occupied not just in the mansion, but in his thoughts. That evening, her assistant arrived at the door, anxious. Mr. Davis, Mrs. Brooks asked me to deliver this. It was a sealed envelope marked confidential. Inside were documents listing Eleanor's assets and company holdings, along with a clause naming him as temporary trustee if anything happened to her. His stomach dropped. He called her cell, but it went to voicemail. Hours passed. Finally, near midnight, headlights swept across the driveway. Eleanor stepped out of the car, pale and exhausted. What happened? Mark demanded, rushing forward. A setup, she said simply. They tried to vote me out. But I stopped them for now. He wanted to argue, to ask why she had named him as trustee, but the look in her eyes stopped him. You trust me that much? He asked quietly. No, she said, almost smiling. I just trust that you will do the right thing. Days later, at another charity event, the pressure came to a breaking point. During dinner, one of the board members, a sharp-tongued man named Richard Hale, raised his glass and said loudly, to Mrs. Brooks and her youthful husband, "May this arrangement last longer than the last one." Laughter rippled across the table. Eleanor froze, her hand tightening around her wine glass. Mark felt anger rise inside him. That is enough, he said, his voice steady but cold. The table went silent. My wife deserves respect, not gossip. Hale smirked. Touchy, are we? I suppose loyalty can be bought after all. Mark stood, every eye on him. No, loyalty cannot be bought. It is earned, and she earned mine the moment she refused to bow to men like you. For the first time, Eleanor looked at him not with caution, but with something like pride. Hale muttered under his breath and turned away. The moment passed, but something fundamental shifted between them. Later that night, as the limousine carried them home, Eleanor stared out the window, silent. Then, almost in a whisper, she said, "You did not have to defend me." "I wanted to," he replied. "You are my wife, at least on paper." She turned to him, her eyes glistening under the city lights. "Maybe," she said softly, "it does not have to stay just on paper." The car drove on in silence, but between them, something had changed, something real, fragile, and terrifyingly alive. The following weeks carried a different rhythm. The mansion, once filled with polite silence, now held traces of laughter and conversation that neither of them had expected. Mark and Eleanor still moved through their routines, the meetings, the social obligations, the board appearances, but beneath it all, an invisible thread had formed between them. It was not loud or obvious. It was quiet, fragile, but undeniably real. One evening, they returned home from a gala later than usual. Rain shimmered on the stone steps as Mark held the door open for her. She paused in the entryway, her silver gown catching the soft light. "You handled yourself well tonight," she said. "You looked like you belonged." He smiled faintly. "Maybe I am getting used to pretending." "Pretending," she repeated, a trace of amusement in her voice. "You did not seem to be pretending when you spoke about the foundation's future. You sounded like you meant every word." "Maybe I did," he said quietly. "You built something good, Eleanor. It deserves someone who actually cares about it. She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. You are not what I expected, Mark Davis. He laughed softly. I am not sure what that means. Neither am I, she admitted. Later that night, Mark found her in the music room. The piano lid was open, and the melody that drifted through the air was soft and hesitant. He leaned against the doorway, listening. You stopped playing for weeks, he said when she noticed him. I had nothing worth playing for, she replied. And now? Now, maybe I do. The words hung between them like a confession. He stepped closer, the warmth of the fireplace brushing against his back. Eleanor, he said slowly, when this contract ends, what happens to us? Her hands froze on the keys. We go back to our separate lives, she said automatically. That was the agreement. But what if we do not want to, he asked. She looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time, he saw fear in her eyes, not of him, but of what she might feel. You do not understand, she whispered. I cannot afford another mistake. Maybe it is not a mistake, he said. She stood abruptly, the spell breaking. Good night, Mark. The next day, the board summoned Eleanor to an emergency session. Mark waited in the corridor outside the meeting room, the sound of raised voices leaking through the closed doors. When she finally emerged, her face was pale but defiant. They want a full audit, she said. They are questioning every decision I have made since the merger. That is absurd, Mark said. They cannot just, they can, she interrupted, her voice weary. And they will. She walked past him, but he caught her hand. Then let me help. This is not your fight. It became mine the moment I signed that contract, he said. She hesitated, then nodded. Over the next few days, they worked side by side reviewing documents, meeting lawyers, confronting shareholders. For the first time, Eleanor allowed him to see the storm she had been fighting alone. Late one evening, when the papers were finally stacked in neat piles across her desk, she leaned back in her chair, exhausted. You did not have to stay, she said. You could have walked away from all of this. I told you before, he said gently. I wanted to. She smiled faintly. You really are terrible at following contracts. He chuckled. I never was a good lawyer. She laughed softly, and the sound filled the room with something lighter than relief. As she reached to gather the papers, her hand brushed his. Neither of them pulled away. For a long moment, they stayed like that, two people who had built walls and were now quietly dismantling them, piece by piece. Outside, thunder rolled over the horizon, and rain began to fall again. Mark looked toward the window, then back at her. Seems like it is always raining when things start to change, he said. Eleanor glanced at him, a faint smile touching her lips. Then maybe we should stop hiding from the rain. For once, she looked at peace. The calm between them did not last. 2 days after the audit began, a storm far greater than rain hit the Brooks estate. News outlets splashed headlines across the morning papers, Brooks Foundation under investigation. Eleanor's photograph filled the front page, her expression caught mid-blink, painted as guilt. When Mark burst into her study with the newspaper, she was already on the phone, her voice controlled but tight. No, I will handle it personally, she said before hanging up. He placed the paper on her desk. They are calling it fraud. Who leaked this? She rubbed her temples, exhaustion visible in every movement. Richard Hale. He has been waiting for a moment like this. He wants me removed from the board. Mark's jaw tightened. Then fight him. You do not understand, she said quietly. The contracts he forced through under my late husband's name, they look like I approved them. If the board believes that, I could lose everything. You will not, he said firmly. Not while I am here. That afternoon, the board convened in the downtown tower. Cameras flashed outside as reporters shouted questions. Inside, the tension was suffocating. Hale sat at the long mahogany table, his smug smile thin and sharp. "Mrs. Brooks," he began, "your sudden marriage to a man less than half your age has already raised concerns. Now, with missing funds and incomplete filings, we must ask if this entire union was simply a strategy to delay accountability." Mark clenched his fists, but Eleanor's hand touched his under the tablet, a silent plea to stay calm. "Mr. Hale," she said evenly, "my private life is not a topic for this board. As for the allegations, every expenditure is documented. You would know that if you had read the reports instead of gossip columns." Murmurs rippled around the room. Hale leaned back, feigning innocence. "Then you will not mind if we open your personal accounts for review." Mark stood before he could stop himself. "That is enough." All eyes turned to him. "This meeting is not about facts. It is about power. You are trying to destroy a woman who built this company from the ground up." Hale sneered. "And who are you, Mr. Davis? A convenient signature? A paid actor in her little production?" Mark's voice steadied. "I am her husband, which means I have seen what none of you ever will: her integrity. She is the reason this foundation exists. Without her, you would not have jobs to protect." The room fell silent. Eleanor looked at him, something like tears glinting in her eyes. Hale's smirk faltered. "You may fool the public," he hissed, "but not the board." He slammed his folder shut and stormed out. The vote that followed was close, painfully close, but Eleanor kept her seat by a single margin. When they stepped into the empty corridor, she exhaled for what felt like the first time in days. "You should not have done that," she said softly. "They will come after you now too." "Let them," he replied. "I meant what I said in there." She looked at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "You have no idea what that means to me." For a moment, neither moved. The elevator bell chimed, echoing down the hallway, but neither of them stepped inside. The war was far from over, yet in that quiet pause, Mark knew the battle lines inside his heart had already been drawn. The scandal did not disappear overnight, but slowly the noise began to fade. Weeks passed, and Eleanor's name started to clear as new evidence surfaced, records showing that Richard Hale had manipulated company funds long before she took over. When the investigation turned against him, his smug confidence crumbled. One morning, the front page headline read, "Board member under probe for fraud." Mark found Eleanor in the garden, the paper folded neatly beside her teacup. "It is over," he said quietly. She looked up, sunlight glinting in her silver hair. "Nothing is ever truly over, Mark. But for now, we can breathe." The relief in her voice was subtle but real. That night, the mansion felt different. For the first time, the air was light. The staff smiled openly, and laughter carried through the halls. Eleanor invited a small group of partners for dinner to celebrate the foundation's recovery. Mark stood by her side, no longer an accessory but a partner in truth. When the guests left and the house fell silent again, she turned to him and said, "You were right. I could not have done this alone." He smiled. "Maybe that was the point. Maybe we were never supposed to fight alone." She hesitated, her expression softening. "Mark, when I asked you to marry me, I thought I was saving myself. But somehow, you saved me instead." He stepped closer, their distance shrinking to nothing. "Then maybe we both got what we needed." The silence that followed was filled with something unspoken but understood. Later that week, Eleanor announced a new initiative for the foundation, one focused on supporting underprivileged students. "Education changes everything," she said at the press event. When she looked at Mark in the audience, her voice faltered slightly, but only he noticed. Afterward, they walked together through the empty ballroom. The chandeliers reflected softly in the polished floor, and the scent of roses lingered from the floral arrangements. "You seemed nervous," Mark teased gently. She laughed, a real laugh this time. "You try giving a speech while your husband stares at you like that." "Like what?" he asked. "Like he actually believes in you," she replied, smiling. They stopped beneath the grand staircase where everything between them had once been just an arrangement. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low, "the contract ends next week." "I know," she whispered. "And what do we do then?" He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the same folded document they had both signed months ago. "We could renew it," he said, "but this time, without any signatures." She blinked, unsure if she had heard him right. I mean I do not want this to end." For the first time, her composure broke. Tears glimmered in her eyes. "Mark," she said, her voice shaking, "people will talk. They always do." "Let them," he said softly. "For once, I want to stop living for what they expect and start living for what feels real." He tore the contract cleanly down the middle, the sound echoing through the quiet hall. She stared at the torn papers, then at him, and finally smiled through her tears. "You really are terrible at business," she whispered. "Maybe," he said, "but I am good at love." And when she leaned in to kiss him, the storm that had once surrounded them finally gave way to peace. Months later, the Brooks estate no longer felt like a monument to loneliness. It had become a home. The laughter of guests, the sound of piano keys, and the scent of blooming jasmine filled the air where silence once ruled. Eleanor and Mark had rebuilt not just the foundation's reputation but something deeper, a shared life that had grown quietly from the ashes of their contract. On a spring morning, sunlight poured through the open windows of the gallery wing, illuminating rows of new paintings. The foundation had expanded its reach, and this exhibit was its latest project, art created by scholarship students they had sponsored. Mark stood at the entrance, straightening his tie, his heart steady but full. He turned as Eleanor approached, dressed in soft ivory, her smile calm and certain. "You did all this," she said, glancing around the room. "You believed in it before anyone else did." "We did it," he corrected. "You and I." She stepped closer, her hand brushing against his. "I never imagined this life," she said quietly. "When I offered you that contract, I thought I was buying time. Instead, I found something real." Mark smiled. "So did I." The guests began to gather, cameras flashing, but neither of them noticed. The world outside could call it what it wanted: luck, scandal, a second chance, but to them, it was simply life, imperfect yet honest. When the final speech ended and the applause faded, Eleanor turned to the small crowd. "Before you go," she said, her voice clear and strong, "I have one more announcement." She reached for Mark's hand, holding it firmly. "Months ago, I signed a contract out of fear. Today, I am signing something else out of love." From her assistant's folder, she pulled a marriage license. The crowd gasped softly as Mark's expression turned to stunned disbelief. "Eleanor," he began, but she only smiled. "This time," she said, "I am asking properly." He laughed, a sound filled with relief and joy. "Then my answer is properly yes." The room erupted in applause as she placed a simple gold ring in his hand. No photographers, no reporters, no stage performance, just the quiet sincerity of two people who had already lived through every test love could offer. Later that evening, after the guests had left, they stood in the garden where everything had once begun. The sky glowed with the last streaks of sunset, and the fountain's gentle rhythm filled the silence. Eleanor looked up at him and said, "Do you ever think about how it started? About that day at Brooks Bistro?" He smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Every day. You offered me a deal I could not understand, and somehow, it became everything I needed." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "So this is what it means to win," she whispered. "Not the money. Not the power. Just this." He kissed her forehead softly. "Just us." The wind moved through the garden, carrying away the last echoes of rain. And as the lights of the estate glimmered in the dusk, Eleanor Brooks and Mark Davis, once bound by paper, now joined by choice, finally found their peace. The best mistake they ever made had become the truest thing in their lives.